sure what is going on, if you guys can see this or not yet. So I'm just going to go ahead. Sorry, I was having a bit of technical difficulties. So thank you so much for bearing with me during this time. Okay, let's go ahead and let's take a deeper look at what is going on in China with regards to the Uyghurs. And we're going to kind of break this down. I have to say, doing the research on this is obviously very difficult because China is very closed off. China doesn't give out a lot of information. China keeps things very close to the chest. So it's really difficult to get a look at what's going on, good or bad. Now, a lot of people think suspiciously that if you're hiding things, which typically is the case, that if you're hiding things, then you're up to no good. But I have to give you a disclaimer about Asian people, Asian cultures, is that that's not necessarily the case with Asians. In our culture, we are very secretive when it comes to negative things about our family, about our lives, and that extends all the way to the country. So even things that, you know, a typical Western family would not find embarrassing, would not think is a bad thing for others to know about, Asian families have a tendency to keep those things very quiet, very private. Shame is a big aspect of Asian culture. So you have to understand that part of China's secrecy might not be because they're doing something wrong, but because they're ashamed of what is happening inside of their own country. This is a domestic issue. This is internal. These are not outsiders. This is Chinese against Chinese in a way. So you can understand where they would feel like maybe we should keep this one a little bit quiet. So I'm going to do my best to kind of break this down now that we're rolling here. I have no idea if what China is doing is to combat extremism is the right method. It might be, but it might not be. So I'm not saying that it is or isn't. I'm saying I genuinely do not know. And my hope is that through opening our eyes and opening up the conversation about all of this and kind of really assessing what's really going on, my hope is that we begin to think about the problem and we begin to brainstorm solutions rather than pointing the finger at one another. It's very easy to point the finger and say, wow, you're committing human rights abuses. Look at you, you're wrong. This is terrible. This is awful. Somebody needs to stop you. That's a narrative that I think the West really would like to have continue to propagate against China. Somebody must stop you. We must stop you. That's how we get into wars. But my point is, I'm hoping that in opening up this conversation and try to keep an open mind. You might already have your ideas on what's going on over there. You might feel like it's one way or the other. But I'm just going to ask you to keep an open mind because this is a worldwide problem and we do need to brainstorm solutions. We need to open up that dialogue rather than just say everybody's doing it the wrong way. There are certainly worse ways than others to handle a problem of domestic extremism. So my hope is that we don't end up demonizing China to the point where we usher in another Cold War, or we try to affect regime change in some way, or we sanction them to where it ends up harming the people, and just kind of doing things to them that ultimately put them in a worse off position, like Afghanistan and Libya, for example. So let's go ahead and get started. In order to understand the conflict of the plight or the situation in China in regards to the Uyghurs, we need to know who the Uyghurs are and where they came from. So modern Western scholars do not think that the Uyghurs come from the Turkic people. People think that the Uyghurs are ethnically different or different in some way from Han Chinese, and Western scholars actually cannot really link the current Uyghurs to ancient Uyghurs. They think that the current Uyghurs are more of an ethnic blend of a many variety of people because that area of China has been conquered by a lot of different groups of people throughout thousands of years. So that region of China, which is now known as Xinjiang, that region was first part of the Jin dynasty, and then which was Han Chinese, and then it was overtaken by, I believe after that it was taken by Turkic people. They came along on the Silk Road during the trade. They ended up in that region. And then the area changed hands and it became under Mongol rule for a really long time. Genghis Khan had control over the region. And then after several hundred years, it went back under Chinese control, under Han Chinese control. And so that region is not really historically, I wouldn't say it belongs to any one people. One of the big questions people have is, are the Uyghurs, this is their homeland, they belong there, the Chinese want that land. You can't really make that claim when it comes to this particular region. If you go way back, it was Han Chinese, and then it goes to the Turkic people who came through the West on the Silk Road, and then it went to the Mongols, and then it went back to the Han Chinese, so it kind of goes on and on. So modern Western scholars do not think they can actually ethnically link these current Uyghurs to the ancient Uyghurs. They believe what happened over time was that conquerors came. So when the Turkic people came, they ended up conquering the people that were there, the Uyghur people, or there's just so many different groups of people. Trying to study that region historically is very, very challenging. There's a whole book on it. And they, usually the people in power or the people who are subjugated by the people in power end up adopting the culture, end up adopting the language, end up adopting the religion. And that's what they believe is the current Uyghur people are people who were maybe oppressed, subjugated, or a blend of the people, because over hundreds of years, people intermixed. Various different people came around the world and intermixed in that region. And the current modern Uyghur people adopted a culture, adopted a language, and even adopted a religion that wasn't historically theirs necessarily. It depends on what you think of that, on how you categorize what's historical. We do know that the Uyghur people were Buddhist until about 930, and then that's when there was the bringing in of Islam to the Uyghur people. Now, the Uyghur people have historically been Hanafi. They're Sunni Muslims, and they practice under the school of Hanafi. Most of them now, so that was sort of traditional, most of them now are Sufi, which is more of a mystical version of Islam. However, there has been a recent push, and modern recent Uyghurs are actually, many, not all of them by any means. The majority are Sufis. The majority are Sunni Muslims, Sufis. They're not at all Wahhabists, but there has been an influx of Wahhabism into the region. And this started, you kind of have to back up a little bit going into the 1920s. So the 1920s through the 1940s, China and Russia, you've got the big world powers that are vying for imperialism. They're trying to march around the world and take over a lot of places. And Russia, the USSR, Stalin was one of those people. And in the 20s and the 40s, through the 40s, Stalin was supporting uprisings of separatist movements that were going on in that region of Xinjiang. The Turkic people had that region for a while, mixed with Han people, and China came in again and sort of reconquered the area. And there were some people that did not want to be part of China. However, there was a large group of Muslim Chinese who did want that region to be part of China. They actually battled each other, so it was Muslim on Muslim fighting. So, and the Chinese Muslims ended up winning that war, and so that region remained under the current Chinese, what's now modern China. So the 20s through the 30s, Stalin actually supported the uprisings by separatists in order to weaken China. And in return, China ended up ultimately having a problem with Russia. So China did this was fast forward quite a few years, you get into the 60s, the 70s, really towards the late 70s and into the 80s, China made a giant mistake. China did what the United States did, and they joined the United States, interestingly, on this one, along with some other countries, in supporting, arming, and training the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. The Soviets were in Afghanistan. The Mujahideen, which we now know have later become the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. The Mujahideen were supported by the United States, trained by the CIA, and guess what? China was in on that too. China ended up actually opening up camps in China, in that Xinjiang region, during that time to bring in the Mujahideen and train them. and also allowed for many in the Xinjiang region, many of the Muslims in that region, to join in with the fighters. I don't know if the United States or if China back in the late 70s, early 80s really understood what that was going to ultimately lead to. I don't know if they really understood that these were, that this form of Islam, this Wahhabism, would end up being so radical and causing as much harm as it has throughout the Middle East and throughout Asia. And even here in the United States, we've of course had some attacks. I don't know if China really realized what they were setting themselves up for, but nonetheless, it happened. And they were just really hell-bent on stopping Russia. And